as I mentioned last week, we got a nice donation from council members Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas as part of the 202 funds, discretionary funds that we have to support this series. So thank you to the both of them. A fantastic support. Jack is the executive director of the Knoxville History Project, a long-time veteran as a journalist and history researcher and author. He's written 12 history books, and let's hope he's got another 12 in him. Jack, take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming out this evening. And we got a great turnout. Appreciate it. And I'm not that surprised because this is a mystery that has been something I've wondered about for half a century now, at least. This house was on the way to my grandparents' house when I was a little kid, and then in the and I always looked down and wondered who could be rich enough to live way back there down deep behind the wall. But then later on in the 1970s, I had maybe the last bicycle paper out in Knoxville history. I don't know about that, but my paper route had a lot of really poor people on it, had a lot of really rich people on it, right in the Bearden and Lyons View area. And the day I started my route manager told me, was impressing me on the necessity of selling people the News Sentinel as much as I could. He said, except for that lady down there, she does not take the paper. She does not want to take the paper. Leave her alone. So I left her alone, but occasionally I would stop my bike up at the top of that always curiously open gate at the top of the wall there and look down at this house. And once a year or so, I would see one or two people down standing somewhere in there. I couldn't tell whether they were men or women, but I could just tell that there were people down there occasionally. This presentation tonight will tell you what we've learned, and I think I and other researchers have learned more than we knew a year ago about Eugenia and her house. But we'll also ask you what you know, because there's still a lot of mystery to her and to this house. She was a woman who was unknown to most of her neighbors. I've talked to people who lived on Lyons View for many, many years who never saw her, but she knew that she lived there. Everybody knew her name, but very few people knew her. And I always heard stories about her, something about a chauffeur, or something about a horse stable in the back, so, something about a mysterious past. And I have wondered about it ever since. And the appearance of the house down this winding driveway from Lyons View, it looks almost not quite real from the road. And I've asked people if they were to draw a picture of this house in their mind's eye, just from having seen it hundreds of times driving by, what would they draw? And I think that most people would draw a symmetrical house. This is not a symmetrical house. If you look at it closely, not at all. It's got a lot of wobble to it, a lot of imbalance to it. But it's interesting to look at for that reason. It is something that is called the style that is built in is something we don't see here very much. It's a style akin to old Georgian style, which was very symmetrical, but it's called Regency style. It was kind of the last fling of Georgian style, in a way, that when Georgian style kind of unbuttoned its frock a bit and went a little bit out of its boundaries. You see Georgian or Regency style houses in the background of a lot of Jane Austen movies, I've noticed. In fact, and I think Eugenia could have been a Jane Austen character in many ways. Her architect was known for this style, and his name was John Fans Staub. That's Fans, F-A-N-Z, Staub, S-T-A-U-B. Both of them are names that are familiar to people who know something about Knoxville history. They called him Fans, at least as a young man. He was kin to two well-known immigrant families who came here after the revolutions of 1848. This great wave of German-speaking immigrants from Switzerland, from Austria, from all over Europe. The Staubs were from Switzerland. The Fanses were from Germany. The grandfather, Ignaz Franz, Ignaz Franz, was a German immigrant who owned the Franz sausage factory in on North Central, and was well known around here. He was, by the way, a partner of the Ziegler. If you go to Market Square, you see only one historic word in the whole square on a building, and that's the word Ziegler. Ziegler was a partner of Franz in the sausage business for a while at least. But his daughter, Franz's daughter, and John Franz Staub's aunt was Emma Franz, who was a model for Joseph Naffel's Madonna, which we have featured in one of our recent, our most recent art wraps downtown. The Naffel Madonna was taken by the artist from Austria, Joseph Naffel, but who was also part of this wave of German-speaking immigrants who came over here after the revolutions were such a failure. But he took a picture of this beautiful young woman and Franz's own daughter, who kind of poses as the Jesus baby in the picture. One grandfather was named Peter Staub, and he was John Franz Staub's paternal grandfather was Peter Staub. He was a Swiss immigrant and a really remarkable fellow in a lot of ways. He came over here back in the 1850s and founded a place called Grootley in the Cumberland Mountains of Middle Tennessee as a rural refuge for Swiss immigrants, kind of a utopian community, and which, like all of the Cumberland Mountains or Cumberland and Plateau utopian communities, were failures, like Rugby and the others. But it was. But he landed in Knoxville after this big failure in his early career, and found a way to build something called Staub's Opera House. And this was our first big auditorium in the whole city of Knoxville. This was opened in 1872, opened with, appropriately by a Swiss immigrant, a project of his, with a showing of William Tell, the great Swiss hero. A play about William Tell opened at this theater. But over the years, this was a major draw, and I think it was our biggest and most popular auditorium in Knoxville for half a century at least. Frederick Douglass spoke there in 1880. Sarah Bernhardt, Lily Langtry, W.C. Fields, the Cohan family, the Barrymores, all performed there over the years, and many others. And Staub, the guy that built it, kind of kept one foot in Switzerland his whole career, and one in Knoxville. He served as a Swiss consul in America early in his time in Knoxville, and later served as a U.S. consul after he was a citizen, as a U.S. consul in Switzerland. So he had an interesting career. I don't know how many people get to do that. But in between, he was elected mayor of Knoxville twice. And here's a guy who grew up speaking German. He was elected mayor twice of the city. But he began managing the theater when he passed along the management of the theater to his son, Fritz Staub, who was the architect's father, when he got into his diplomatic career more. Fritz Staub and his family settled on Temple Avenue, which was just off Cumberland. Long before it was part of UT campus, is now part of Volunteer Boulevard. But that's where the architect grew up, in that area. I think of Temple Avenue as being kind of like a street from Meet Me in St. Louis or something. It was a street with a streetcar on it, and a park down the street. Circle Park was already there. So this is the neighborhood that John Franz Staub, Eugenia's architect, grew up in. But this was, and he also grew up very close to the university, obviously. But he knew his grandfather, his grandfather Peter Staub died as a result of a traffic accident involving a runaway horse in 1904, when John Franz Staub was about 12 years old. So they obviously knew his grandfather, and grew up with his last name attached to one of the biggest and most popular buildings in Knoxville. His grandfather built it, his father managed it, and young fans sometimes performed there. He was very proud of his dancing ability, and he would dance for crowds at his grandfather's opera house in those early days. He was a very creative, very energetic kid. Won an award for a presentation, creative presentation about the U.S. presidents. I would love to find out more about what that was about. In 1908, I believe that was. But was in he was an honor. Went to Knoxville High School, the public high school. He went to all public schools in Knoxville as a young kid. Graduated from Knoxville High School as an honor graduate, and along with another honor graduate, Paula Tyler, who, if you're a real literary geek, know is James Agee's aunt, and the woman who James Agee describes as the musician living at home in his famous piece, Knoxville Summer 1915. So this was the kind of the group of people that Fan Staub grew up knowing. She later founded or helped found a music school in New York. He once, Fan Staub once gave an oration about American cities at Staub's Opera House. He went to UT around 1909. This is a fact that you will not find in his Wikipedia entry. Unfortunately, that's true for a lot of people who went to UT. It seems like Wikipedia almost deletes everything associated with Knoxville if possible that they can take out, or maybe Knoxvillians just don't have the gumption to add those things in. But he was a UT, went to UT, and I love to imagine who he knew at UT, the people who were at UT the time that he was there. And UT was then just up on the hill, very small college, a couple hundred students, so they all knew each other. He would have known Clarence Brown, the future MGM director in Hollywood. He would have probably known Bernadette Schmidt, who later won the Pulitzer Prize for History about his book about the First World War. And because Fan Staub was a math major, I'm sure he knew Cooper Schmidt, who was Bernadette's father, very well beloved professor at UT. And if you go to the Austin Peay building at UT, there's a plaque for in memory of Cooper Schmidt, who actually died in the middle of the lecture on the Hill in 1910. He was a member of a literary club called the Cercle Français, and while he was at UT, he was at Staub's in a show called Parisian Romance at Staub's Theater. He was editor of the yearbook at UT while he was there. In 1914, he graduated from UT in 1913. In 1914, he went to MIT to study architecture. UT did not have an architecture program at that time, but he kept performing in Boston, interestingly, in cross-dressing roles. And there are actually descriptions of these in the Boston papers in those days. In one role, he's described, John Fan Staub from Knoxville is described as creating a presentation of feminine characteristics that made all the women sit up and take notice. So close a copy was it. That was a bit of a surprise in my research. But he got 2 architecture degrees from MIT and apprenticed with a well-known residential architect named Harry Lindeberg. Lindeberg was a guy who was well known for his kind of historical themed houses around the country. He did some work in Knoxville, one house for the Sanford family. He interrupted his career as an intern for Lindeberg to join the Navy Reserve Flying Corps in 1917. This is, of course, World War I. He was a fairly heroic guy. If you have any prejudices against a guy that cross dresses and is known as a dancer, well, he proved them wrong by his valor in combat. He won the Navy Cross for his attack on a German U-boat in the English Channel. He came home with these commendations, married a woman from Massachusetts named Madeline, who'd been studying interior design. They had a couple of children. He shared a passion for kind of imaginative revivalist design with Charles Barber from Knoxville. And I think at this point, Staub was planning to move back to Knoxville. And they offered him not just a job, but a partnership in this fairly young company at the time, Barber McMurray. In 1921, he accepted this partnership. partnership. And it was announced in the newspaper that Barbara McMurray was soon going to be Barbara McMurray and Staub, that he was going to join them here in his hometown. But he said, I have one more job I have to do in Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas was hiring him to build these really elaborate kind of historically inspired house designs in Houston for millionaires. Now, Houston, you might know, just exploded in the 20th century. Houston used to be smaller than Knoxville until the 20th century. And because of the oil boom and automobiles and everything else, Houston just was suddenly where everybody wanted to live. And there were a lot of sudden millionaires who lived in Houston who wanted to prove that they were millionaires by having these really big, elaborate houses that were designed by people like Staub. But he became one of the best, most in-demand home designers in the city of Houston. He designed the famous Ima Hogg mansion called Bayou Bend. Ima Hogg was the daughter of a Texas governor named Big Jim Hogg, who, for reasons of his own, named his daughter Ima. But she was proud of herself, proud of the name, and built this house called Bayou Bend in 1928, which became a showplace for Houston and is still a showplace. It's a place you can go and see. There's a collection of decorative art at this showplace that was designed by John Van Staub from Knoxville. Meanwhile, he designed at least 3 houses in Knoxville. One was a house for his Aunt Emma and her husband. It's called Hopecoat. That they got national attention and House Beautiful magazine. It's still at UT campus to this day, and is very well preserved. I'm glad to say that UT uses it as a guest house. It's a fascinating old English cottage style house. Unusual place. Another house they designed in the same neighborhood there on kind of that neighborhood back there was torn down for a UT expansion. I'm sorry to say, in the 1960s. It was only about 20 years old when it was torn down. But Staub is still best known in Houston, and there are at least 2 big books about his life and career. Books that don't say as much as I would like them to say about Knoxville and UT and his origins here. But they show the importance of Staub's legacy in Houston. Anyway, this is the architect. I wanted to talk about the architecture first before we get to Eugenia, who's the lady who hired him several years later to design a house in Staub's hometown. Eugenia, as I say, I've wondered about her all my life, and I don't know why I haven't looked more into her. I know that when she died in 1998, there was a flurry of interest in her, and there were people who remembered her saying a few things and feature stories. And I just figured I could that was somebody else's story to tell at the time. Besides a few paragraphs in our historic Bearden book, which came out last year, I've never researched her before Aslan asked me to start giving tours. The Aslan Foundation, of course, purchased the Eugenia Williams house after working out a lot of legal issues, and is going to do something great with it. I think they're going to fix it up over the next year or 2, and we're giving tours to the public to let them see the house, to see what it looks like now, and see how it will improve over the years as Aslan fixes it up more like bringing it back more to what it looked like when Eugenia first had it built in 1941. Part of her family, and I think we have to talk about her family to begin to understand Eugenia, goes deep into Knoxville history, and she's has some old family blood in her, and more about that later. Most of her family, though, were the people that she grew up knowing as her family were relative newcomers to town. And the newest of the newcomers was her father, and that was David Williams. He was a doctor. He was from Gainesville, Alabama, a very tiny town southwest of Tuscaloosa near the Mississippi border. He was born in 1863, in fact, the same week as the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, just to give you some perspective on his life. And to think that his daughter just died, 23 years ago. But that quite a span there. His father, who was also known as David Williams Sr., was a doctor, and his mother's name was Eugenia, which will come up again in the story. It was a high achieving family. He had a brother named Eugene, who is a state Supreme Court justice. He had another brother named Gessner, who was a delegate to the Alabama Constitutional Convention. And we have a picture of Gessner that my colleague Paul James found today. I'd never seen this until today. Gessner, and I wanted to show this not because he's a major figure in the story. I'm not sure that he rarely came to Knoxville, but this, we don't have a picture of David Williams, so we might assume that maybe he looks sort of like his brother. But this is his brother Gessner. Gessner was a member of the Alabama Constitutional Convention of 1901, I think, but later may have had issues with Alabama politics because he moved to California and he ran for mayor of Los Angeles in 1919. But this is the kind of family that David Williams came from. David Williams, was proud of his father. He wanted to go in the medical business himself. He attended Vanderbilt University in the class of 1884. He went from there to Bellevue Hospital Medical College, a very well-known medical school in New York, and graduated in 1888 and was the class president. He was very well thought of there. David Williams' connections to Knoxville is one of the many mysteries of this story. And if anybody out there knows anything about that, I would love to talk to you. Knoxville is 400 miles from his home in Alabama, so it's not like he wanted to be close to home by moving to Knoxville. And a guy that had been class president of the Bellevue medical school graduating class could have certainly found work in a big city in the Northeast New York or anywhere else he wanted to live. But a couple of clues. One is that while he was still in New York at Bellevue, he wrote a eulogy for Dr. Matthew McClung, who was a very young Knoxville doctor who was studying at Bellevue when he happened to come down with pneumonia and died at the age of 32 in New York. And apparently David Williams knew him better than the others and wrote this eulogy that was published for Dr. McClung. So that's one connection. But another connection is another reason he might have moved to Knoxville was that the year after he graduated, Knoxville opened something called the Tennessee Medical College. This was the longest lived medical school in Knoxville history. It was opened in 1889. Dr. Williams was teaching at the medical college by 1891. Here's a picture of the medical college. This was on Dameron Avenue, and I love the resonance of history. The site where this is very close, or actually touches where the current Knox County Health Department is. That Dameron Avenue has been connected to health-related issues since the 1880s. It also had a hospital on it one time, but General Hospital was there as well, connected to the medical school. But the medical school was there first. It was kind of a big deal, something Knoxville was very proud of in the 1890s, and seemed to have a possibility of going places. In 1892, he came here and gave a lecture at the State Medical Association that met here, and interestingly included in that big convention, the Tennessee-wide statewide medical convention meeting in Knoxville in 1892, was an extended trip to Eastern State Mental Hospital on Lyons View Drive. And this was, if Dr. Williams had not seen Lyons View before then, he did then. He did at that time, certainly. Lyons View was considered kind of remote. It was outside of the state limits at the time, and was not a place that people went often. It was it was kind of a rugged road went out there. But this medical convention met there in 1892, and it's likely that Dr. Williams went out there and may have said, "Gosh, what a beautiful place this might be to live." but he was Dr. Williams was on the faculty of the Tennessee Medical College. He was a professor of theory and practice of medicine, and later was in charge of the college's bacteriological laboratory, which sounds kind of dangerous, but that's what he was doing in the 1890s. He was an outgoing, charismatic guy who is often referred to as a Toastmaster, a guy that was known for public talks, very outgoing, very people connected with him very easily. He was elected to the Knoxville Board of Health in 1894. He founded the Fortnightly Medical Club, which sounds kind of fun. It was a big dinner club for doctors that met occasionally. He was also a member of the Knox County Surgical and Gynecological Society, which met, we don't think of doctors doing this today, but met for smokers, big smoking occasions in various downtown locations in the 1890s. But anyway, he was a young, charismatic doctor, obviously a very eligible bachelor, and I suspect a lot of affluent families were lining their daughters up to meet Dr. Williams. He was 33 when he met, or actually when he, in his early 30s when he met Ella Cornick. She was a very young woman, 13 years younger than he was, but a member of her father was a very prominent lawyer. Tully Cornick was a lawyer. He was one of the big go-to lawyers of Knoxville of the 1890s. The Cornicks were from Virginia and were relative newcomers to Knoxville, but part of her family was descended from the Boyd family, which goes way back in Knoxville history. One of her ancestors was Mayor Samuel Beckett Boyd, who had been mayor back in the 1840s and lived in Blunt Mansion. One of his sons was a guy named John Mason Boyd, who is, you might recognize that name even if you don't study history, because you see it every day on Gay Street. It's on the corner of Gay and Main, the porte-cochere, our beloved physician, John Mason Boyd, and the courthouse lawn. And that's the guy right in the middle of the picture there with his rather large family. John Mason Boyd was a doctor who was involved in actually the first known successful hysterectomy in medical history, according to some medical journals have made that claim. But he was a well thought of doctor, but it was a very creative and prominent family, the Boyds in general. It was a lively, creative family. One Boyd was an opera singer. One was a pioneering journalist, Patty Boyd. They were also more distantly related to Belle Boyd, the notorious Confederate spy, who kind of made a vaudeville career of telling her stories later on. But Ella Cornick's mother actually ran what was called an elegant hotel in downtown Knoxville. And they got married at Christmas in 1896, when Dr. David Williams was 33 and Ella was 20. This was I think considered a pretty good match in those days. It was described even in the out-of-town papers. The Chattanooga Times had a story about it at St. John's, and it was invitation by card only. And this is interesting. There were armed guards at the door to be sure you had an invitation to come in. I don't know if it was just because they were expecting an overflow crowd for such a high-profile wedding, or what. But Paul, do we have the picture of St. John's? But this was kind of the wedding of the season anyway. Yeah, there's St. John's as it is today, and this was the same building where they got married in 1896. But it was a very big deal. The father of Ella Cornick, Tully Cornick, the lawyer, was there. He was 47 years old. He was a widower. His wife, Ella's mother, had died young, and he had married a young woman named Annie Cornick, who, as it happens, was younger than the groom. The David Williams' mother-in-law was younger than he was. And she'll come up later. That's I'm bringing her up now because she's a character in this story. Annie Cornick stood out in other ways. She was mostly these people from the South. She was from New Jersey, and her father was from Brooklyn. So she had a different cultural background perhaps than some of the other people at the wedding. They had a bad year. The Cornicks had Tully and his wife Annie had a daughter, Rosa, who had just died earlier that year. That happened a lot, of course, in those days, and that's part of this tragic story in Eugenia's family as well. Anyway, after they were married, Ella and David Williams, they lived at the Hotel Vendome, which was on Clinch Avenue, and this was one of the most elaborate, most elegant, I should say, places to live in Knoxville in the 1890s and early 1900s. This is it looks like a vision almost, this place. It was down near the corner of Walnut Street. It's been gone for a long time, but you see those, multiple balconies, and there was a French restaurant up in that corner cupola there. It opened in 1890. It was a very posh and interesting place. By the way, a lot of people ask whether Eugenia Williams was kin to Tennessee Williams, who was descended from Williams families in Knoxville. And he, as far as I know, there was no even distant kinship between those families. But Tennessee Williams' grandfather lived in the Vendome about this time, and they probably passed each other in the lobby as they were going in, or sat near him in the French restaurant. Anyway, Ella was an outgoing young woman. She was just full of vivacious, full of energy. She hosted ladies only card parties. This was something she was well known for. She founded the Matrons Euchre Club. I love the name of that, the Matrons Euchre Club. She was a member of the Whist Club and played whist too. She loved card games, but she also co-founded an organization that's still around, and I've attended their meetings. And it's a great. If you get a chance to go to one, please do. With the Tuesday Morning Music Club. It's just a kind of mostly classical music organization that gets together and they just play music, different selection every meeting. My grandmother was a member, and I was interested to find out that Eugenia Williams' mother co-founded this club that is still around today. And she was perhaps the first female golfer in Knoxville history. Before Cherokee Country Club, even, there was something called the Golf and Country Club. And it was not on the west side, it was on the east side. It was near Chehawaii Park. And it was a 9-hole course. And she, originally they said no women allowed, but apparently they made an exception for her and her stepmother, because Ella and Annie both played golf there when it was thought to be a men's only golf club during those days. Anyway, they were happily married, young, very prominent young couple, and their daughter Eugenia was born on January 14th, 1900. She was named Eugenia Fluoride. This is her as a very young girl. There are only 4 or 5 known pictures of Eugenia Williams that we know of. If you know of one, please let us know. But this is the first of them, the ones we're going to show tonight. And we're showing pictures tonight that nobody in Knoxville has ever seen before tonight. So I'm glad so many people got to join us. But she was born in January 14th, 1900, and named for her grandmother, who was born in 1832 and was still alive. And this gives you a sense, again, of the stretch of history. And please forgive the fire truck, which is going by on Summit Hill Drive right now. But anyway, this was she was named Eugenia Fluoride Williams, 1900. Really lived almost the whole 20th century, but never lived in another century than the 20th century. But about this time, fairly early on, when she was about 2, when she was about the age that this photograph was taken, this may be 3 or 4, I can't tell for sure how old she is, but her father met a guy named Patrick Roddy. who was a young guy, a guy who come here from the country, kind of a classic Horatio Alger sort of a story, a guy that came from the country literally with everything he had in a sack on his back. And he got interested in the idea of he got connected with a local candy maker named Goodman, and they together began talking about this new product called Coca-Cola out of Atlanta, which had been people were just beginning to bottle it in different cities. And Mr. Roddy and Mr. Goodman got together and said, we'd had Coca-Cola around on Fountain for several years. Peter Kern sold it on Market Square. But Roddy and Goodman got together and said, gosh, what if we could bottle this stuff? And they started bottling it in a laborious manual process first. And Roddy started thinking, what if we had a factory and they could do this? We could do thousands of these a day, perhaps. And we just need some money, need somebody with a stake in it. And according to the story, I don't know how much of this, I'm not completely sure how Roddy met Dr. David Williams. But the family story has been that he was their family doctor. This is a little bit surprising because Williams was known as it seems to have been known as a gynecological specialist. And, but I think he had a general practice at one time too. So this may well be true. But anyway, he talked to him and said he had this great idea for bottling Coca-Cola. And Dr. Williams had an eye for profit, but he was also, I think, interested in the product. Coca-Cola in 1900 roughly was interesting to doctors because they were starting to see the problems associated with morphine, with opiates. In those days, they used morphine kind of liberally in the 1890s, and people were starting to see this is causing really serious problems, as we know today, even still with very similar products. And he said, Coca-Cola is supposed to make you feel better. Why don't we take Coca-Cola? Why don't we start pushing Coca-Cola more? By the way, at the time, Coca-Cola, you might know that Coca-Cola originally had a bit of cocaine in it. I think at this time it did not any longer, but I think the caffeine and the fizz just made people happy. So it was something that doctors were looking at as a cure for stomach ailments and things like that. And he was interested in that side as well. But anyway, he invested, gave him a big stake of money, put it into a bottling plant. By the way, this is I think the Roddy brothers in a very early Coca-Cola truck, the sons of Patrick Roddy. But this was something that seemed to be likely to be a hit. Dr. Williams, by the way, was involved in some other investments. He was also vice president of Loudon Hosiery Mills, and was a big investor in that factory. But this Coca-Cola thing started taking off, and they were I think Dr. Williams, who was pretty affluent already, was finding that he was rapidly getting rich. He and his wife and daughter Eugenia moved into what they called handsome apartments on Main Avenue at Walnut. Back then, Main Avenue was mostly residential and mostly affluent, and this was where they lived in those days. Happy affluent family. They had a daughter, Elizabeth, who was born about 1906. They by this time were taking long trips to Florida and fishing in the Gulf down there. Especially on the Gulf Coast, but this is also the first of several tragedies that they encountered. Elizabeth, Eugenia's younger daughter, died before she turned 2, but in early 1909, her brother David was born, David Jr. or David III, if you count his grandfather. But Eugenia, about this time, was sent to a boarding school with the 2 parents. Still grieving for their first daughter to have died, and then and taking care of a new son, sent Eugenia to boarding school up in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure why they picked this particular one. It was called Mountain Female Seminary. But this was one of the few pictures that we found, and that we thank the researcher that connected with with the Aslan Foundation. Mark Kasperzik up in Chicago, architectural researcher, found a yearbook from the school, and that is Eugenia right in the, I think, right in the very middle of the group of girls, the one that looks perhaps the most uncomfortable of all of them. But go back to the previous one. I think there's something kind of about her. They said that at school she was very quiet. She did not like to participate in sports. But if you could get her talking about something she was interested in, she was an interesting companion. And they mentioned that she had an unusual walk as well. There's some interesting clues about her in these kind of senior profiles that they put out. But anyway, she was there at the time that her mother, Ella Williams, back in Knoxville, took ill. She had a cough. It seemed to be pneumonia at first, but it went on for months and months. I suspect it was tuberculosis. She went to a sanitarium in Asheville, which was known for that sort of thing, and died that October 1914 at age 38. And this is, vivacious, outgoing Ella Williams is no longer in the picture, no longer part of the family. And Eugenia apparently was bitter about one aspect for the rest of her life, that the fact that she was not told about this. She was left in school and not told about her mother's illness and death until after she came home and found out her mother had already been buried at Old Gray Cemetery. Anyway, this is by 1915, Dr. Williams was a member of the consulting staff, which was reorganizing Knoxville General Hospital. In early 1916, he erected a handsome home, as was described in the paper, on Kingston Pike, which is also sometimes called, referred to as a house on Lyons View. And this is pretty interesting because in those days, you know that where Old Kingston Pike is, that was Kingston Pike in those days. And that's not very far from Lyons View. And I think it's possible that Dr. Williams' house was on Lyons View, but his driveway went down to Kingston Pike. And that's where his mailbox was, and that's where his address was. And that's where how people approached his house in those days. And I'm curious about the guy coincidentally named Staub Street, which would be kind of approximate as the driveway for such a thing. It's just an idea. I'm not sure if that's true or not, or if some of these records are just confused. But some people have described this as a Victorian house, and it's not the house that we're talking about. This is a different house that he built on Lyons View. This is not the Staub house. Some people have described it as a Victorian house. Very few people were building Victorian houses in 1915, 1916, so I don't think so. But no photographs are known of it. If anybody out there has a picture of Dr. David Williams' house, which was only there for about 20 years, we would love to see that. Before they were able to move in, though, Eugenia's only other sibling, who was still surviving, David, young David, came down with probably rheumatic fever and died in 1915. There are stories that she was there for his death, and it was it was a maybe too memorable experience for her. So this must have been a horrible thing for Dr. Williams to deal with. Dr. Williams, who was a man of healing, a man known for his facility with some kinds of illnesses, at least, to lose his wife and both of his children at way too young ages must have been especially frustrating, and perhaps made him question his whole place in the universe. I'm just projecting. If you were a doctor and you lost most of your family to disease, it would be even tougher than it might be for other people. But anyway, by this time, by the way, Eugenia, whose picture we just saw, was already on the board of directors as a teenager of Roddy Goodman, because her father, of course, had put her there. And she was close to her mother-in-law, Annie Cornick, who was actually, Dr. Williams was close to her as well. And it appears that Dr. Williams and Annie Cornick may have lived together downtown. And whether this was considered a scandalous thing or not. They were both unmarried people in their early 40s who had both lost children, and were both widowed people, but living together. I can't tell that there was any gossip about them, but they were. In fact, I think that we would know about it because Annie Cornick was a teacher in public schools, and they were very sensitive to anybody that was living a less than perfect life. In fact, they even liked married women to be teachers. They liked their women to be single women who were living alone or had perfect moral character. But Annie was a teacher, and she was the first female principal of a public school in Knoxville history. She was principal at Boyd Junior High School, which was on Union Avenue, where the Daylight Building is now. And after there was a catastrophic fire there in the 1920s, she marshaled resources to have the school meet in a church and moved this whole school to different places that would take them until they could rebuild find a new place for their school. Meanwhile, Eugenia was back in town, and she met a guy named Gordon Chandler. You might hear stories about Eugenia being married, and when I first heard that she was married, I heard it was for a very short time, and it was just a brief thing that should never have happened. And I found something a little bit different story from that. Gordon Chandler was prominent in his own way. The Chandlers were not nearly as rich as the Williamses, but they were actually in the paper more often because his father was a public servant, a very well-known public servant. He started as a cop in the saloon era days. He had become chief of police. He was later postmaster of the city. I think later still was safety director. W.P. Chandler, I see his name a lot in stories. But Gordon Chandler was born in 1897, was a little more than 2 years older than Eugenia. Even his mother's side of the family was prominent too, because his grandfather was Dr. M.M. Harris, who built the building we now know we later knew as the Regis Restaurant Building, which is still there where the nonprofit group is. But that was the Harris Building originally. So he was well connected to prominent families. He served in World War I, just like Staub did, and I think he was hoping to have a heroic career like Staub did. He was one of the first from Knoxville to volunteer for the war. He went into the Army Signal Corps, learned to fly planes, was wounded in a bombing of an airfield in England early on, and probably never got to fly in combat. He became a staff driver and sometimes an observer for artillery groups, but came back without having served, but not being hailed as one of the great heroes of the war. He attended UT, but not for long. I think he eventually got involved with his father's real estate and insurance business, and married Eugenia. I'm not sure how they met or what they saw in each other, but they married very quietly compared to her parents in November of 1920. She was 20 years old. Some say Dr. Williams disapproved because she was too young, but she was the same age that her mother was at the time. Notably, neither one of these were college graduates, which is interesting because her father had a graduate degree and much value, and been a professor and much valued education. So he may have just wished that she would go to college before she got married. But they lived in downtown apartments like her parents had. Eugenia apparently tried to be as social as her mother had. She hosted at least one socially prominent card party. One attendee was Evelyn Hazen, who's the other mystery lady of Knoxville history. So I would love to have been there to see Eugenia Williams and Evelyn Hazen at the same card party of two of eight attendees at this party. But they were Eugenia and Gordon were married for quite a few years and did a lot together. They lived for that 15 years, lived a life of travel and style. They spent a lot of time in New York at the Waldorf Astoria. The newspaper always said where the hotel they were staying in. They danced. They went to Chicago. They went to Atlantic City. They spent a lot of time in Florida with and without her father. They owned cars. They both loved cars. They owned one of the first Rolls Royces in Knoxville. They owned a Bentley. They had a Duesenberg. They had a Hupmobile, kind of a sporty car. She, in fact, was later claimed to have the record for driving from Knoxville to Florida in the Hupmobile in 12 hours. So that it was quite a feat at the time. She often appeared in newspaper gossip columns for no reason other than what she was wearing. She would show up downtown with something amazing that people had never seen before because she shopped in New York, and the Gwen Fifi, the gossip column, the News Sentinel, would describe in detail what she was wearing because they knew that they were going to be trying to wear the same thing next year because Eugenia Williams was ahead of everybody in that regard. But Gordon Chandler, by the way, was very social, unlike Eugenia, who was, I think, I think by the time she was a teenager, she was withdrawn, she was introverted, not as outgoing as anybody else in her family was. Gordon Chandler was very social. He was a man's man. He loved, he was a garrulous guy, loved to tell stories. Later on, Bert Vincent, the News Sentinel writer, would love to talk to Gordon Chandler because he always had stories to tell him. Gordon Chandler was good at billiards. He won billiards championships downtown. He loved to go fishing and hunting. There's stories he would get in the outdoors column for his fishing and hunting. He would sometimes do both the same day and brag about it. He was a gambler, and he won a pool bet on when Lindbergh would land in France. He may have had he was an aviator, and people saw him as an expert, and because of that, he later recommended a horse called Seabiscuit in the 30s. But through the Williamses, he came to love deep sea fishing and began to do a lot of that in the Gulf over the years, and would catch a tarpon and put on display in a show window on Gay Street so everybody could see it. And anyway, they were both. Meanwhile, they did a lot of traveling together too. They do seem like a couple, even though they're very different personalities. They went to. But they also had some kind of a dark side to them. They both spent a lot more time in the hospital than you would expect young people to do. And Eugenia in particular was at Johns Hopkins for several weeks in 1922 taking a treatment, and it didn't say a treatment for what or what kind of treatment. But she was much improved, they said, when she got out. But anyway, they seem to have moved. They lived downtown until the mid-20s and seemed to start gravitating over toward Lyons View, where her father lived in this house that he had built several years earlier, and apparently lived there alone, perhaps with Annie Cornick at this time. But he didn't have any other family to live in this big house that got the attention of the newspapers when it was built. Anyway, he kept living there, kept going to Florida a lot with them occasionally, but he died in 1929, about just days before the stock market crash, significantly. Surprisingly, the funeral, he was cremated, and the funeral was in Cincinnati. I'm not sure why that was. He doesn't seem to have had any connection to Cincinnati that has ever been mentioned in the papers before. This guy from Alabama who spent most of his life in Knoxville had a funeral in Cincinnati, but the reading the will was a little bit surprising. It got in the papers that he'd left a large amount of money to National Geographic Society, which is not mentioned in regard to him in his public life, but also left a life estate for his daughter Eugenia. He didn't give her his estate. He had his estate take care of her for the rest of her life. But it was a problematic will in some ways. She, I think, may have been disappointed that obviously she was disappointed that she didn't have more control of it. It was written to let her live in luxury, but not to be able to give her estate to anyone else. But it was 1931 saw the first of several lawsuits over the will, and there would be multiple lawsuits over a period of the better part of a century to come. But meanwhile, Gordon had spent time in the hospital too, and one was for appendicitis, but other things are not mentioned what he was in there for. it was in 32, by the way, that Eugenia got in the paper for her trip to Florida, 643 miles in 12 hours in a hubmobile. So it was she was very proud of that by herself. At that time, she was driving by herself. But in they stayed together. You see them, their names linked a lot, Gordon and Eugenia Chandler, until August of 1935. And the last time they were mentioned together going to a social event was that year when they went to the Chandler home on Magnolia in 1935 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of his parents' marriage. A little bit ironic because by early 1936, just a few months later, Eugenia and Gordon were divorced. The story that Eugenia told some people was that she had learned that Gordon was having an affair with his secretary. And in fact, Gordon Chandler later did marry a woman named Hazel, who had been his secretary, and they had children together. And this must have be one reason she didn't take the newspaper when I was her paper boy, the News Sentinel, on a couple of occasions. His children were especially cute, and the News Sentinel one time, almost taking up half a page, had pictures of his children in the paper in the late 30s. But immediately after their divorce, Eugenia in 1936, Eugenia drops the name Chandler altogether from her own name, and she defiantly began start calling herself Miss Eugenia Williams, and she called herself that for the rest of her life. Now, there's a possible alternate explanation that came up recently, that there's some online indication that she may have married a man named Williams about this time. Our researcher, Mark Kasperzik, found this on Ancestry.com, and that it would appear that she married, that there's one indication online that she married only 3 months after her divorce to this guy, Lee Williams, perhaps in Florida, but he could not find more definitive documentation for that. So he's a good deal more skeptical about that than he was. But in any case, she was connected to a guy named Lee Williams for a long time, and this was the only person that she was personally associated with, of the opposite sex, certainly after the divorce with Gordon. But more about him later. Meanwhile, she was spending a lot of time with Annie, she called her aunt, but was really her step grandmother. But in 1938, she began looking at this house that her father built on Lyons View. She was living there apparently, and built a $2,000 mule barn in the back. And this is, I think, if you calculate that for inflation how you want to, but that was probably a $40,000 or $50,000 project by modern standards. And that's still there on the property. We'll see pictures of it in a minute. But that was considered remarkable. They called it a mule barn, but it was a horse stable in her time. But she tore the house down and moved into an apartment in Kingston Manor with Annie Cornick, her step grandmother. Anyway, she built a wall about this time. I think we'd start showing pictures of the house now, Paul. The wall, which got a lot of attention at the time, I think was annoying to a lot of people. And I think she, one of the few people I've talked to who knew Eugenia, said that she actually seemed to enjoy aggravating people. But this is standing up at where the wall is, looking down at the house by that kind of gracefully meandering driveway. And this is the scene that I saw as a paper boy every day as I rode my bike by twice, because I rode by it twice. But she enlisted Staub to design a house in 1940. Staub came here and began drawing plans for this house in 1940 for Eugenia. Staub was known for what a regional style of Regency architecture, and that was a style that was adapted to the climate of Houston, which is sometimes even hotter and more humid than Knoxville is. So this is a house that was built for the heat and humidity. The house looks more looks grander from the front than it is when you go inside. It's actually a very thin house. It was built that way so that there's lots of opportunities for ventilation throughout the place. But you see the kind of the off kilter aspect of it, the hexagonal windows on the left side, and the it's not a symmetrical house. It's an interesting house to look at. But it was but Staub was already famous by then when he came up here to work with Eugenia. Apparently he said, in fact said this to several people, that she was his toughest customer after I'm a Hog and anybody else that he worked with in Houston. None of them compared to Eugenia Williams. But he loved the detail work, the kind of played with the old Georgian style in this Regency pattern, and used some kind of ironwork that some people have said is New Orleans style, but other people have called it Louis XIV inspired. Anyway, these are all just detail shots of this house, which is obviously almost all the windows are boarded up because they've been broken over the years. It's the house is in pretty rough shape, but then again, it's completely it's intact. There's no part of it that's ruined. It's all, and there's a little bit of water damage in there, but not very much actually. They're terracotta, even though the roof is black. Those are terracotta style tiles that had been kind of weathered and molded. They'll be a different color by the time they're restored. Interesting old place. All the balconies are balconies you can walk out on, and that Eugenia sometimes did walk out on. But she moved in here in 1941. She moved in here with Annie Cornick, her step grandmother, who was then in her 70s. And apparently had a couple of servants. And one of the many answers one of the questions I want to answer is, who were her servants? And I would just love to find out their names, even if they're not still around. If they're still around, I would love to talk to them. But if anybody out there knows anybody that worked for her at this house, I would love to find out about it. There are 2 dormitory rooms inside the house for service quarters where they lived. Let's look at some more pictures, Paul. Yeah, here's the interior stairway. One of the more interesting features of the house. It was the ironwork has been attributed to a guy named Walter Cantac, who is a New York-based metal sculptor who is known for his modernist sculptures, but he made his living by doing kind of period design, decorative work for houses, and had worked with Staub before. The interior decorator, by the way, was a woman named Jane Christian, who had worked with Staub's wife in college. The floors are all that wonderful wooden. I'm trying to remember the name, but and this is the walnut library on the western end of the house, which is not a very big room. It's probably not bigger than your typical mansion's library, I guess. But it is room for, I'm not sure I could get even half of my book collection in this library, but it's a very pretty room. And it's probably where she met with her lawyers over the years when she was challenging one thing or another. She's known to have liked romance novels, by the way. She's known to have read romance novels in those days. All right, next I guess we can go back. Okay, this is going into the living room, which is kind of adjacent to the library, and this is a wonderful alabaster mantelpiece here. It's the more elaborate of the 2 alabaster mantelpieces in the house. But with these great old kind of classical scenes. Would love to think that there's some clue about Eugenia and there, but I don't. I'm not seeing anything peculiar enough to be a clue. But beautiful work. All right, we're here in the, this is the dining room, which is, again, these rooms are not enormous. This is a room that might be good for a dinner party of maybe as many as a dozen people. She is not known to have entertained a lot. In fact, I've talked to two people who knew her. They both know of one party that she had in this house, and one said that it was a party that didn't go very well because of some inebriated guests. But anyway, this is probably where she and Lee Williams, her believed to be companion, who was her chauffeur. This was the chauffeur we heard about, was this guy named Lee Williams, who may have, I'll just say may have, lived in the house with her for some extended period of time. And we still don't know the nature of their relationship, whether they were married or even boyfriend and girlfriend or not. We don't know these things for certain. So I'm careful about my history, and I'm not going to make any assertions, but he did do the driving for her in her later career. I think she loved to drive and was very proud of her driving up to the age of 40 or so. And after that, I think she just had enough of it and said, I'm going to let other people drive for me. But she still loved cars. And there's a 3-car garage right underneath this dining room. But in the next room that we're looking into, that's the butler's pantry. A lot of people walk in there and say, gosh, what a big kitchen. What a nice big kitchen. But it's not even a kitchen. It's the butler's pantry. The kitchen is even bigger than the butler's pantry. And these are some pictures of the kitchen. What that looks like safes on the right, those are freezers and refrigerators. And believe it or not, all of this is original to 1941. And on the left, you see that lid open. That's a dishwasher in the butler's pantry. That is an automatic dishwasher from 1941 that is still intact and probably still works. I haven't tried it, but it's amazing if you think about it, how many stoves or refrigerators or dishwashers does a typical family go through in 25 years, and look at this, and these are 80 years old, and they all still appear to work or be in workable order at least. But yeah, more kitchen pictures. The kitchen is pretty enormous for it looks like a kitchen for a big church or something. And you wonder why the kind of the kitchen to dining area ratio is as high as it is. It's one of the kind of oddities of the house. This is all GE, by the way. All this electrical stuff is GE, and something that they were probably pretty proud of in 1941. All right, this is the butler's pantry again, and these are chutes on the left that you can send your garbage down. And we're looking up at the kind of the upstairs now. That's the servants' stairs in the background there, and another way to get upstairs. There are 2 big guest rooms upstairs on the eastern end of the house, and they're pretty remarkable. This is an amazing there's something like this in several of the rooms upstairs. That this vanity is more vain than most vanities because it has these automatically unfolding lights that light up the mirrors. That if you just flip the switch at the bottom, it unfolds the mirrors and you see them open. Okay, is this a film, Paul? All right, here we go. That they're just opening automatically, and they come on when they open. They're off until they actually open up and they actually come on. But it's an interesting and eccentric house in lots of ways. Here's that kind of balustrade with those some call them Louis the 14th or 15th style ironwork there. It's been attributed to Mr. Cantak. Next one. All right, this is the eastern side and the 3-car garage that's through this door. There's there's still a control for these automatic garage garage doors, again from 1941. All this is period stuff. She had an automatic garage door opener in 1941 and would stop there at these posts and push a button to open whichever garage door she fancied pulling her T-Bird into. She had a T-Bird in later years. I think it was a convertible, as some have described it, a blue convertible that she just drove around town and went to Long's drugstore, went to the Western Plaza beauty shop. And also, believe it or not, I just learned today by talking to someone who knew her, guess what her favorite bar in town was? She and Lee Williams would drive over to Broadway and go to the Corner Lounge back in I guess the 50s, 60s. And people would say, Eugenia, why do you go there? There's so much nicer places in West Knoxville now. And she said, I just like that better than any of them. And she would go to the Corner Lounge on Broadway. I wonder if anybody there knew who she was. And here's the veranda in the back. It's this is a feature of a lot of some people have claimed that this is was meant to evoke her love for New Orleans, but in fact, a lot of Staub's earlier houses in Houston have something very similar on the back of them. But beautiful long veranda, which will be more beautiful soon, and a great river view. The river is very steep, a steep decline from here, but it's the river is very clearly visible from here. As I say, it's a very thin house, so we could open windows and catch every single breeze there is in the house. One thing she didn't have in those days, and I think never had, was air conditioning. So it was just open. It was a house built for taking advantage of river breezes, as Staub's other houses in Houston were. All right, here's the house as it looks from the road that leads down to the stable, which is kind of in the to the southeastern part of the house. And the stable is built before one interesting thing about the backyard is all these millstones. And you think with Eugenia's kind of fancy taste for lots of things, it's kind of surprising she was interested in historic, authentic millstones, but you see them all over the property in the back, and they're trying to figure out what to do with these and how to highlight these in some future garden interpretation. She had gardens back there down to the river at one time, we think, but they've been overgrown for decades and decades, and we're not exactly sure what grew back there. If anybody has any memory or knowledge about that, please let us know. Okay, here's the stable back here, and it's a remarkable stable because it has an all slate roof. It's amazing. It looks like a Sequoia Hills house, and this is actually just a stone's throw from part of Sequoia Hills. Calumet Circle is less than 150 feet from here. But this is the stable where her horse lived, and perhaps a stable boy as well. There's a space upstairs that looks livable to me, at least. It's this is inside, steps going up to the loft. Yeah, Paul and I got these a couple of years ago when UT still owned it. This is off limits now. The stable's all closed up until they fixed it up. And it's got these old, you call those casement windows with iron frames for windows. It looks very 30s throughout the stable. And again, all these touches look like an actual residence. But all right. Well, there. And that was sometime before COVID that picture was taken. But anyway, well, thanks a lot for joining us, everybody. Would love to take any questions or comments, or especially if you have any memories of Eugenia. We'd love to chat about that. Next week, we're talking about Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach, who was a Swiss, very unusual, eccentric Swiss journalist who came here and did kind of a study of Knoxville in both words and pictures, and will be sharing her photographs from 1937, mostly from the downtown area. All right, be happy to open it up for questions, comments, and I've got a notepad here for anybody who has memories or sources or anything else we can look at.
Jack, Anne Winslow is asking, did the Faust property border her property?
That's a good question. I know about where the Faust property was, but and it's possible I'll see if it had some.
The Mahan property abutted. The Mahan property.
Yeah.
And that was in, and then the Faust was part of the Mahan property.
Okay, yeah.
But the Faust property and the back part of the Faust property did abut.
Yeah.
I wonder if Lynn Faust, and I don't remember her married name, would know.
Well, Lynn Faust is not, she was, she's married to Edgar.
Okay.
So she's a daughter-in-law.
You're right. She's not the,
But believe me, I know. Yeah.
I believe you do.
So if those were stables back there for horses, where did she ride the horses?
Well,
There's
there's
enough
enough.
developed back in there too.
Yeah, there's enough space around there. I think there's
Oh, yeah.
24 acres around there, and it's enough you could get a pretty good trot going around down. And I've heard that she made circles around on the riverside down there. But I don't know for sure, and that would be an interesting question to know the answer to. She didn't apparently didn't talk. I recently interviewed a woman who spoke to her a lot in her later years, and she was didn't talk about horses much except to say that she had a horse, and that was all she would say. She was not very not very forthcoming with any kind of personal information, but I've heard secondhand that she did take the horse out and give it a good exercise now and then.
Jack, my dad just had an interview with the Aslan architect, and one thing that I thought was so interesting was they said, why would Eugenia, who hated Knoxville, she clearly hated Knoxville, why would she build a house in Knoxville? She clearly hated it.
Well, what did she like anything though? I haven't seen her quoted, saying. She's not quoted saying much of anything at all. But she could have gone to New York. She could have gone somewhere else. It was. I don't know if there's anything in the will that insisted she live in the house on Lyons View. Maybe there was, but.
Well, I will have to ask Dad, because when he was talking to the architects, he said with conviction that she clearly stated that she hated Knoxville, or acted as if she did. So
yeah. Well, she liked the corner lounge, and that's that's as Knoxville as you can get. So that's interesting. And she loved Long's Drugstore too. That's another Knoxville institution.
Jack, you mentioned the Boyd family. How was she connected to them, and were they connected to the Boyd Station folks out in West Knox County?
Yes, yes, at least distantly. They were the Boyds were on her mother's mother's side or something like that. It was something like that. It's on her, obviously on her mother's side, and I think it's on the Cornick side somehow, even though the Cornicks were from Virginia. So it was on her mother's side somewhere. I should have actually made I drew out a family tree just to because I was getting confused myself about who Annie Cornick was. It kept confusing me that she kept calling her aunt. I thought, how can that be her aunt when it was actually her step grandmother? But I actually did draw out a family tree and connected them all. but she, I think, was her great grandmother probably was a Boyd. I'm thinking. But yeah, the Boyd family are all kin to the Boyds of Boyd Station in West Knox County.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
Can you just give a quick, real brief? Some people are asking, they're not sure who the Aslan Foundation is and what their plans are for the house.
Yeah, good question. The Aslan Foundation is a charitable foundation founded by the Lindsay Young estate, and has been doing just a lot of interesting, good stuff around town. They fixed up Westwood, the house on Kingston Pike, several years ago. They did the amazing work over at Fort Dickerson recently, and also at Fort Higley, a place known as High Ground Park was created entirely by the Aslan Foundation, and they've done a lot of work on South Knoxville recently, including Log Haven, which was supposed to open this year as an artist community, but didn't just because of COVID. But they preserved most of the best part of Log Haven and as a permanent asset for artists and musicians and writers to go spend some time. But they were involved in the botanical gardens years ago, but they have not announced plans for the Eugenia Williams house. But they I think have made it known that they want to make it something that's going to be an asset for the city, not just for some private purpose. So I suspect it will be publicly accessible in some level in the future.
You want to mention the tours you're giving as well on behalf of Aslan?
Yes, you can sign up for tours. Right now, they're very limited, 12 people per tour, and they're twice a month. So you can sign up for them on the Aslan Foundation's website. And most of them have been full up every time, except this last in February. It was in the 20s, and of course the house is not heated. So we had very, very low numbers for those, but otherwise we've had good numbers, and a few people who had some connection to her, either her or the house. I found at least 2 or 3 trespassers who've come on the tours and confessed to having visited at Eugenia's house without her knowing it. But it became kind of a dare for people I think for decades to drive a car down. And one of the many puzzles about her is she built this big forbidding wall, but didn't put a gate on it. So anybody could, anytime, could always just drive through the opening and not worry about it until they saw her with a shotgun or something. But anyway, any other questions, or anybody here besides? I'm glad Betsy joined us. Anybody here besides Betsy ever encounter Eugenia? I got to interview Betsy a few months ago about her memories.
I have a
Any other
question, Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I toured the house maybe 10 years ago or so, and I was really surprised at what awful condition it's in. You know, that the inside is just, it's a gut job. And I was surprised that I mean, I've been in a lot of 60-year-old houses,
yeah,
or 70-year-old houses that aren't in that kind of condition. I mean, it was wretched. And I don't think at the time all the windows.
I would disagree with you to some degree. There's a lot of stuff that's missing in the house that needs to be put back, but it's amazing, for example, that the kitchen is intact, that the parquet floors are intact. And by the way, someone I should have credited earlier, Brian Pittman, the architect, shared a lot of his lore about Staub and Eugenia with me. But he says he's been through the house and has found only one creak in the house. And that's certainly not true of any house I've lived in. But there is a lot of stuff that's missing, and there are 2 or 3 places where there's some water damage. But in general, it's pretty solid. I mean, there's the parquet floors are intact, and the railing, all that stuff, you walk up the steps and there's not a creak as you walk up. You know, it's a lot of it's in good shape. It does need a lot of work. I mean, the windows are broken, and you know, there's lots of there's missing fixtures and things like that I think people have stolen, who even just on tours apparently over the years, like knobs and things like that. But in general, I think I've seen much worse houses brought back to life.
Yes, and the mantles are in place.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And they're in perfect shape. I mean, they look like they just come out of the artisan's shop. Yeah, Eden lives just down the street from there.
But I've never been in. I've always been like you, like, woo.
Yeah, we'll
Drive
sign
by.
up. We'll get you in
All right.
if you want to. But there just many interesting questions about all this stuff, and I'd like to find any information out there. If anybody knows, like the servants, it's interesting that we know the names of William Blunt's slaves, but we don't know the Eugenia Williams servants' names, and I would love to know that, for example.
Hey, Jack.
There are, yeah.
We have a question about UT. You know, they owned it for quite a while because it was named in her will, that they were never able to develop it. You want to take a stab at summarizing that real quick?
Yeah, well, that's you kind of summarized it right away. It was toward the end of her life. She met with what's the name, the president of UT in 1970s. I knew him personally. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but she met him and actually made a gift of the house to UT to use after her death as the president's mansion.
Was it Ed Holt?
I'm sorry, Ed Bowling.
Ed Bowling, yeah.
Yeah. But it was, and it seems like it'd be, it's kind of distant from campus. I think I always thought the old Sequoia Hills President's Mansion was too far from campus to be where the president lives. But otherwise, it's perfect for something like that, a show place where you'd be entertaining guests frequently. But I think the combination of the distance and the state of the house, which would have been extremely expensive for a public university to take on and justify it, probably would have made it prohibitive. And also during this period, there was a lot of turnover in administrations at UT. That you know, she died in '98, and that was during a time of a good deal of instability at the top at UT. And I think nobody really just committed to make it work. And it took lawyers a long time to find out how to do something else with it. And I won't pretend to try to explain how that finally worked, that the Aslan Foundation was able to buy it. But they own it now, and I think they're going to do good things with it.
Died there. Weird.
Any other questions, either from chat or comments? Or I would love to find out, Eugenia, if there are any letters, because she was in a lot of interesting places in her life. She was in New York in the 20s, and just think about frequently, and just think about all the stuff that was happening in New York in the 1920s. And did she ever see Duke Ellington? Did she ever meet Cole Porter? Did she ever ever know Robert Benchley or Dorothy Parker? I was involuntarily muted, but anyway, I would love to find out if there are any letters or anything like that about any of her impressions. I get the impression of her from that rare little personal bit about her at the boarding school in Pennsylvania as a very insecure young woman who really didn't like to be around people very much, and I sometimes feel that way myself. But so I sympathize. But I I think we all want to find something else in her, and wonder more about what her interior life was like, or what she thought about things. Did she hate Knoxville? And if so, why? Because she only knew certain parts of Knoxville, as far as I can tell. So all this is pretty fascinating to me. And a lot of people move out of town after a nasty divorce, and she stuck around. In fact, Gordon Chandler lived only about a mile and a half from her house. He lived in the Bearden area when he was raising his own family in a very simple little rancher. But did they ever acknowledge each other? I think probably not. But I'm just interested in this. I don't want to prod more into personal life than we need to, but I think she kind of lived the 20th century, and her family alone connects her to lots of different aspects of Knoxville, and also her legacy is one of our greatest pieces of domestic architecture in town.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
The questions are coming up. Do you know what happened to any of the belongings in the house, any paintings, and also where did she live in the last years?
In the later years, yeah, I should have brought that up. She had a fall in the 1980s, and even though she was got to where she was able to walk, she preferred to be around medical personnel. So she actually worked out some kind of a deal with St. Mary's Hospital that she lived there more or less for the last 14 years of her life, I think. With a caretaker who would drive her places, would drive her to the beauty shop that she used to like at Western Plaza, which is a beauty shop that I knew well as a kid, because I used to sit there waiting for my mom or somebody else to get through there. But did anybody even know who she was at that time? But about the furniture and stuff, I honestly do not know. I've been told the Roddy family might have some of it. It wasn't necessarily priceless furniture from what I hear. It's intriguing to see all the places on the walls where you can tell that the pictures were hanging there for many years, just from the way the panelings faded here and there. But I really don't know what was there for sure, or where it is now. She had very few friends. One of her friends was Annie Cornick. She traveled a lot with her, and Annie Cornick lived with her until the mid 40s, and then I think they may have had a falling out because Annie Cornick moved out of town, and when she came back into town, she didn't stay with Eugenia. She stayed with other people, with the Van Deventers and other people. But the other people in her life include one woman in New York who was her shoe supplier, or Belgian shoe supplier, who she was a good friend of, and they would visit each other occasionally. But she had very, very few close friends who would be able to answer any of these questions.
Thanks again, guys. It was fantastic and
right, well,
fun. Lots of fun.
Thanks for joining us.
Nothing like a good mystery.
Yeah.
Hey, Jack, I had a question.
Yeah.
You said Eugenia had a lot of fancy cars. Do you know whatever happened to those, or?
I suppose you just wore them out. The really fancy ones I've heard about were back in the 20s and 30s. So they probably just wore them out after a while. I've only heard about one car in her later years, and that was a Thunderbird. And who knows what, and that's not a really unusual car. So probably just sold that when she moved out.
Just curious, would you know Gordon Chandler's address, where he used to live?
I have it somewhere, honestly.
Because I'm from Bearden, so I just wondered.
It's over off Paper Mill, kind of. It's kind of on the edge of Bearden, kind of on the off paper mill at Weisgarber, just on
Oh, yeah,
the,
yeah.
just I may it may be barely north of the interstate, so it's kind of just kind of barely in the area we think of as Bearden.
Hmm. Is it still there, do you think?
That's a good question. That's the kind of thing I usually check, but it was on Liebern Lane. It was called.
Oh, I remember that. But
Yeah.
wasn't that kind of swallowed up by Interstate 40?
It might have been. He died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1958.
Wow.
They both had drinking issues, and he apparently
Hmm.
his were worse than hers. So that was he was still in his 50s when he died.
Hmm.
But that was about the time they were building the interstate. So yeah, I should go over there and see if I see any trace of something that looks like that. By the way, his obituary in the newspaper, News Sentinel, was described him as big, good-looking, popular. He had a familiar figure about town in earlier times, but in recent years, Mr. Chandler was primarily a home and family man. It did not mention Eugenia at all.
What about his descendants? Do you know anything about them?
I have tried to track them down and failed. If anybody out there knows anything about them, they would probably be how old would they be? Probably in their 60s now. His son and daughter. His son went to Bearden High. I know, but that was in the early 70s, I think. Fascinating lady, fascinating house, and like I say, I should have just put up the family tree, because there's so many interesting people in her family, and you wonder if she felt she was supposed to live up to her mother's example is this great social founder of many things in Knoxville, and daring golfer and all the things that her mother did before her early death, and her cousins who were pioneering in various professions, and maybe she just never found what she loved.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
So my whole life, I heard that the wall that Eugenia put up was a spite wall, so that Mrs. Swan could not see. But that's false, because first of all, you cannot see the river from Eugenia's house, and second of all, you could not have seen the river from Mrs. Swan's house across whatever landscape to. So do you know what is that?
You can, just a little correction, you can see the river from Eugenia's house when the vegetation's down. And in fact, even the winter time now, you can see it pretty clearly from the back veranda there. But that's a good question. I'd heard various stories that I don't want to repeat about the woman across the street that she didn't like. And I looked up who was there when the wall was built, and it was an elderly teacher that as far as I can tell, and I can't remember, she was like a nutritionist. I thought, who could have something against an elderly nutritionist? But it was who was kin to some people I was going to call and check on that. But where did Ms. Swan live exactly?
Well, so the Swan houses, they were relatives to the Smiths.
Yeah.
So the Smiths had the houses that were where the country club is.
Yeah.
And I think that the Swan house, but I don't know, I'd have to ask my dad. But my imagination tells me that the Smith house that I'm thinking about, the Swan house that I'm thinking about, was directly across from the wall, because I always heard that it was a spite wall.
Yeah, yeah, and it would have blocked the view of the mountains. Not you couldn't see the river from there, but the mountains. It's a beautiful view of the mountains from there as well.
There's not even a how.
If you had certainly a second floor, I think from the other, you could see the mountains from there. I think. But I did talk to the lady that took care of her in her later years, and she said she loved to aggravate people. That's what she just said. That was some people just like that, and she had the impression that she built the wall just to annoy the people on Lyons View. Even though I can't find any personal connection except for the fact that this woman was a teacher at the school where Annie Cornick had been principal. So that's an odd connection. So that there's no smoking gun there yet, but I'd be curious to know, because you can kind of figure out who lived where in 1940 when she was planning this wall. And but yeah, good question. Now walls are kind of de rigueur on Lyons View. It seems like it used to be our most famous, one of the city's most famous assets was the Lyons View. People would literally walk. Wallace Stevens, the poet, walked from downtown. He was a lawyer here in town in 1915. Walked from downtown to behold the Lyons View, and it was like it was a public park almost, because he could walk out there in 1915, and there are lots of people out there. Just hanging out. But one thing I didn't mention that I should have was that Lyons View was an African-American community mainly until about 1900, 1910. And you still see right next door to Eugenia's house is the African-American graveyard, which has
And the church.
Yeah, and the church, exactly, which is still operating church, and what used to be the school there, which used to serve the Lyons View community. One interesting thing about her was in 1946, I think, or one of the few times she came out in public, and after she moved into the house, was to challenge the property assessment of it. She always claimed it was not worth as much as people claimed it was, and she said, "How can it be worth this much when it's right next door to a colored cemetery?" That was one of her claims of her attempts to reduce the value of her house for tax purposes.
Yeah, that's gross, but yeah.
Jack, we have a question about Eugenia's pets. Did she have any?
I have not heard of any except for the horse. But that's a good question. She traveled enough that might have been a problem, but I have not heard of any. But is anybody else out there heard of any?
I'm curious if Jim Haslam Sr., I guess, his wife grew up in that area, or did she grow up in that area? Does anyone know? I can't remember Haslam's wife's name for some reason.
Yeah, Natalie.
Yeah, she's lovely.
Her father was an optometrist downtown, and I just realized recently that the reading glasses that I use and can't find right now were from their office. They were headed down from my grandfather or somebody in my family, and I've been using them all these years. And I thought, well, I should look up where this came from, and it was from that optometry office, probably in 1930.
Dr. Leach.
That's right. Yeah.
I just wondered if she had any memories of her own,
Yeah. Good. I think everybody's heard something about Eugenia and has some theory, like I did at age 14 on my bike, and would hear all these stories and I always heard about her stories of her and a chauffeur, and it was an old lady and a chauffeur, and I always pictured a young chauffeur who was perhaps had some connection to this old lady, and but in fact Lee Williams was a little bit older than she was, so they were close to the same age, and it's not exactly the rumor that you picture when you think of a chauffeur taking care of an old lady. And
your Bearden book is just fabulous. So
well, thanks Eden, appreciate it. Thanks.
Yes, love the Bearden book.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. It's historic beard, and you can order it off our website.
Got it.
Yeah, good.
Interesting place to grow up.
Yeah, yeah. More interesting than I. It was funny when we started writing the Bearden book. People said, "Bearden, seriously? I mean, what is what are you going to write something about Kroger's or something?" And it was, there's a lot more to it than I thought about when we got into it. It is a fascinating and multifaceted.
Yep. I consider it my hometown, actually.
Yeah, me too.
But I'm glad we preserved a lot of it, like Lakeshore, which still has one of those old buildings that when Dr. Williams went there to that medical convention in 1892, that building was there. So Dr. Williams probably walked in there as a very young.
Have you seen the destruction of the community next to the railroad tracks in the past like 9 months, 6 months, 5 months, 3 months?
Sorry, which community are you talking about? The
Okay, so the railroad track, like right on Agnes or
and Gore Street.
Oh, you mean the old Lyons View community? That's being. I haven't heard about that.
Bulldozed.
Oh, I know. That was my home. I lived there. It just got bulldozed. I'm so sad.
Oh.
My uncle died. My mother died. We sold the land to a developer because we didn't know what else to do with it. The houses were too old to do anything with.
It makes me very sad, but I understand. But
Yeah, it makes me sad too. But they told me that they were going to build like an old like a nursing home or something like that there. I don't know. I have no idea.
who knows? Anyway.
It's sad, but there wasn't anything there to save, you know?
Oh, no, I disagree. There were things to save there. If we had only known. There's a whole community. Jack Neely knows there was a whole community there.
There still is a community there, right? And the Lyons View community is still there.
Oh, the Lyons View. Yeah, I'm talking about just where I lived.
Yeah.
Like behind Buddy's Barbecue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The railroad tracks.
There wasn't much there.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody, all of the neighbors that I'd known growing up, none of them lived there anymore. And no one lived in some of the houses. And of course, Mother's house we rented for a while, but other than that, those were the houses on the other side of the railroad track from Betty's.
Yeah, okay.
You know, where on Gore and Agnes.
Yeah.
My parents and my uncle and aunt owned from the railroad down to Walden.
Mm-hmm.
Just old houses.
Yeah. Anyway, we can go on and on and on. So it's
been great. Thank you very much, Jack. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it very much. This is the longest we've ever gone with one of these things, I think. So this is but I'll stay here until there are 3 or 4 people left. So
yeah. We got 34.
Yeah, and that's a good crowd for some of our talks. So yeah.
All right. Well, I guess I should just sign off.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, Eden. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, it's been fabulous.
Thanks.
So
join us next time.
Oh, I will.
Oh, good.
And we will meet as soon as we are able to meet.
Yeah, hope so. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Yeah. Night.
Yeah, see ya.
Bye.
Jack, the reading glasses you can't find right now?
Yeah, they're here somewhere. I've been working so hard this week that I've got whole.
They belonged to Dr. Victor Holloway.
Oh, did they? You know this?
Well, you told me this years ago.
Okay. Oh, maybe. Maybe you're right. All right. Yeah, Dr. Dr. Holloway. He was an interesting guy. He lived in, to bring it all back around, lived in Westwood, which Aslan refurbished a few years ago. Yeah, he was my great grandfather's first cousin, Victor Holloway. So that's why I have his glasses, I guess. But they still work. That's a great thing about reading glasses. That if you don't scratch them, they're just as good now as they were a century ago.
Jack, this is Mark Haspazek. We
Hey, good to
exchanged
see you.
emails for a bit there.
Yeah.
Regarding Dr. Williams' former home, I did send you an email with an attachment where we found the image of what the house looked like. It's an aerial photo, probably from 1920s or 30s.
Oh goodness, I missed
Kind
that.
of zoomed in on it so you can see what his house and the gardens look like. It's much different from what Eugenia's is.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
How would you
interesting to
describe
see.
how would you describe the style of it?
2 stories in brick.
Just that simple?
Yeah, it's pretty simple.
Federal or whatever?
It was in the background of the photo, so you had to zoom in on it and it gets a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
It didn't look to be anything special.
Yeah.
And it was much smaller than Eugenia's current house.
Yeah, of course.
Also have access to the original drawings where his house was dotted in relationship to her house now, and it's a lot smaller, or it was a lot smaller.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I apologize for missing that. I gave a talk, an hour and a half long talk last night about urban renewal. So I've been covered up with, and we got several projects in the work this week. So I'm missing some attachments now and then, but I'll go back and look at it. Yeah, could you tell anything about the driveway? That to me, that's interesting. If the driveway went all the way down to beyond Lyons View, which is kind of my working theory about it.
Right. I'll have to send you the uncropped version of that. I didn't look to see if it went that far.
Mhm.
Could have. I know Eugenia did change the driveway a little bit, but she kept it pretty much where it was.
Yeah, but the driveway, my theory, considering that Dr. Williams is often described as living on Kingston Pike in the 1920 era, that was that he had a mailbox on Kingston Pike, and
Right.
that was where people entered his driveway to get to his house. And then they would drive across Lyons View to get to his house, which was at that time, I think, not even a paved road. So that's my working theory that I'm just waiting, looking for reasons to shoot down at this point. But I guess an aerial shot might have a clue about that at least.
Right. We have a few from that era, which I can send to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks. We're learning stuff all the time, and really appreciate your finding. I think three, I guess, of the only 4 pictures I've ever seen of Eugenia Williams. She surprisingly, given her interest in fashions and the number of mirrors in her house, did not like to be photographed at all, and forbade it more or less. And it was so there just aren't any pictures of her in the whole middle part of her life, between when she's 16 years old at prep school and when she's an old lady at St. Mary's. I'm sure there's one out there somewhere, but would we even recognize it?
I've only seen those 2 young photos of her. I haven't seen any of her as an adult.
Yeah. There's one picture of her in a wheelchair at St. Mary's, I think in her 90s.
Okay.
Any more questions?
All right. Well, it's after 8 o'clock, folks.
Yeah, me too. God.
All right. Well, we really appreciate it. I'm going to go home and fix supper.